I'm Steve Rappaport. I'm the Knowledge Solutions Director at the Advertising Research Foundation and the author of the ARF Listening Playbook. Listening has become very, very popular. And as it's become popular, people are asking them, people have questions. They're asking, what is it? And how is it used? And how is it done? And where is it going? And these are questions that we've heard before. A few years ago, back in 2006, we heard those questions, not around listening, but around online advertising. And my earlier book, called the Online Advertising Playbook, answered those questions. And it just struck us that they're being asked again. Let's do something similar. So I undertook a research effort to come up with not what's the hype around listening, and to look at all of the poster children, for listening that we're familiar with, but let's really look at it from a research basis. Let's look at it from the standpoint of case studies. Let's really understand the technology and the ways in which the work is done, and also let's get a view on where it's going. So that's what we did, and that's what this book is about. So what is listening? And for that, what we did is we developed a definition that listening is, well, first, a lot of people think that listening is just listening to social media conversations, so that it's all online. Not true. Only 10 to 15% of conversations around brands are online. 80 to 85% or 85 to 90% are offline, and that's a statistic that comes from Keller Fay, which is a company that specializes in monitoring and tracking online and offline conversations. So listening, it involves conversations, but it also involves behaviors and also signals, like biometrics. And while our book really just focuses primarily on the conversations, we are going to look into behavior and the signaling a little later as more research, more evidence comes along. Take behavior. Behavior is really looking at what it is that people do and observing kind of trends and patterns. So we have an example in the book for Hennessy, the cognac. And what's interesting is that Hennessy they weren't planning on it. They really stumbled on a new market. And how did they find that new market? They did it just by doing a routine analysis of weblogs. Because my hunch is that they were doing like a search engine optimization kind of exercise, and as part of that, you look to see who's linking to you. And what they found was that quite unexpectedly, there was a whole ton of links coming from a social network called Black Planet. Black Planet is the largest social network for African Americans in the country. And what they learned was that this Hennessy was like a great brand, really popular on Black Planet. People were linking to it. They were scraping some of the images and pictures and so forth. And from that, they got a hunch that there was really something more there. And so from there, they did some additional research and found that it was really a very attractive market, and eventually revamped their whole marketing campaign to really focus around that. But that all stemmed from what I like to think of as behavior, which is looking at the linking patterns. So that's an example of behavior. In terms of biometrics, the work that's being done by Carl Marcy at Interscope is really very interesting because they're interested not so much in just how individuals respond to advertising, but how groups respond. And so one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is when you have a group of people who are watching a program and a commercial and things, they are silently signaling to one another. And getting some insight into that, I think, is really fascinating and a real opportunity for understanding people and how they react to one another and how they react to advertising and media, and that is a whole untapped area that will probably be very fruitful, but it's a little too early for that right now. The definition is about conversations and also behaviors and signals. What's also interesting is that some of the conversations can be guided or unguided. And some people think, well, the only value is in listening to unfiltered, unguided conversations, and we don't feel that, because as long as the guidance is somewhat indirect and eliciting, you can get some pretty good information from people. And the third part of the definition is that we're doing this not to eavesdrop and not to be voyeurs, but to really understand people better and bring their voices into the brand, so that the brand can respond, better, more, better, and I'd say more aptly to people and their needs, their interests, their desires. So how is it used? I mean, how do brands use listening? If you read just the trade magazines and things, you get the idea that listening is just really for consumer insights and things. But what we found was that that's only part of the story. In fact, listening is used to really help brands achieve what I think of as the full spectrum of marketing objectives, beginning with discovering a customer, right? Sharpening messaging, innovation, R&D, customer service, loyalty, and retention. And in developing the cases for the book, we developed over 35 of them. We started slotting them into objectives, and we found about a dozen, and I just reeled off a few of them. One I've talked about, which is the Hennessy example, good example of using sort of behavioral listening to get some clues to what people are doing, and to use that as a driver for looking into a market more effectively. For dealing with some issues that marketers confront, like how do you maintain sales momentum when you've got no new product news? And in fact, this was the case for the Mini automobile. The first year it came out, gangbusters, did great, wonderful. The second year, there was no new product. So, and that's really a problem, or it can be, because in the auto business, it's really driven by new product, relaunches, right, updates and upgrades to existing models. Wasn't any. So, so what Mini decided to do with a listening vendor called MotiveQuest and their agency, which is called BSSP, is they looked to see how can we really understand really the Mini customer and see if we can develop really communication strategy and a set of programs that can really involve and engage them and keep the thing going. So, so this is what they did. They listened to conversations that people were having around the Mini and some of the cars that competed with the Mini, like some of the Volkswagen models and things. And what they learned was that the conversations around the Mini were almost as if the car was a pet. People like to take pictures of it. They like to meet up with others. If they saw another one, they'd honk and wave and things. And it was a real community, a total community sort of thing. Whereas for the other cars, it was more about performance, drivability, handling, fuel economy. So, things about the cars themselves, not so much about their community and their experiences, right? So this was their insight. And then what they did is they developed a series of programs, right, based on that insight. So one thing they did is they said, well, people like to feel they're part of a club, we'll make a club. And they invited them with a special mailing and invitations, things like that. Second thing they did is they created sort of like roadshow meetups. So they went around the country inviting Mini owners to come and kind of show off their pet, and talk to one another, and walk their dogs, and whatever else you do with those kinds of things. Take pictures and ooh and ah over their modifications and stuff. The third is that Mini puts a Bluetooth chip, right, into every car that they sell. So then they did something with digital signage, right? So they made certain billboards respond to the chip, right? So as you're driving along, right, the billboard recognizes you and says, "Hey, how you doing, Steve?" And things, and really just give you, just a little something that makes you smile and enhances a connection with the brand. So what's the result? The result was that sales kept going. And how did they do that? It was really interesting. MotiveQuest has developed a measure that they call the online promoter score. It's kind of similar to the Net Promoter Score that you're probably familiar with. And what it was able to show was that every time they put one of these programs into the market, the online promoter score went up, and that's an advanced indicator of sales. Sales went up, and they were very happy. And then the following year, they were able to introduce some new products and things. So, that's one example of how listening is used to develop programs, to keep sales going, even when the circumstances might be that favorable, right? And shows how it can involve not just the great insight, but how that's really brought to the marketplace. Listening is really great for new product innovation. There was an example from J.D. Power Web Intelligence. They couldn't name the brand it was, but what they were doing was looking to develop new food products for active women. And so a good part of this project was listening to women. And what they did, which was really interesting, was that they listened to women, the conversations throughout the day, over the course of the day, from the morning, to the late evening. And what they were able to detect was that throughout the day, women's needs changed, right? So, there was a time of sort of like getting yourself together and organizing, that was in the morning. And then later in the day, you needed more energy. And then later in the day, in the early evening, you wanted to wind down, and so forth. So, so they were able to detect, from their listening, these what they call need states. And then they also looked for recommendations that bloggers and other online voices were making. It's like, if you need to organize, what would be really helpful is if some brand, provided us with an online diary, or when they had connection needs, to create sort of a social network where people could go, women could go and talk and just sort of share their thoughts and feelings and frustrations and happiness and so forth. And then later in the day, to really sort of wind down, after the children to bed and to be with their partner and so forth. And so so they came up really, and I think this was the sort of the fascinating part of this story, is that some of their solutions were product related. So they came up with ideas for little doses of chocolate, or or little products that that help them get through the day. But then also these kinds of services that aren't really a product. You wouldn't package them and sell them through a retailer, but you'd create a place where people could go and hang out and experience things online and share themselves. And it's this ability of listening to be able to pick up, right, the sort of interactive elements, as well as the product opportunities that really make it very, very valuable in ways that you may not see just from doing some other research. The last thing I'd like to say about this case is that J.D. Power has a framework, strategic framework for doing new product innovation, and the listening research fit into that. And that's an important lesson to take away, is that it's one thing, you can just listen, but if you have a method or a system for doing so, it makes it that much more valuable. One of the questions that we get asked is, how does listening replace doing surveys? And people tend to look at it as an either-or proposition, but it's not. As with most things digital, it's and. It's surveys and listening. The idea that listening will completely supplant surveys and things is I think, an erroneous one, because surveys have an important role to play. They document, they size, they set proportions, they put numbers on things, which listening isn't yet really able to do. An example of how these can work together is, to tell a more complete story, is from Gillette, their Fusion razor. What was interesting is that they introduced this razor, and gangbusters, great first-year sales. But this is a razors and blades business, so what you're looking for is the replacement blade business, second year out. What they found was that not so good. Sales were soft, and they said, what the heck is going on here? Let's really figure this out. So they did a survey, and the survey showed that there were some factors, right? The quality of the shave wasn't good. The price was high. A couple of others. But they also complemented this with listening, and they looked to hear, right, what guys were really saying about all of this. And what they found was that, yes, the guys were talking about price and shave quality and things, but they were talking about it in a different way. It wasn't just like, here's why I'm not buying. It's more like, you know what? The shave is good, it's a little better, but it's not greatly better, And because it's just a little bit better, the pricing's out of whack, And so what Gillette said was, you know what? Let's bring the pricing in line with the quality of the shave improvement, and we'll send that out as messaging. And they did, and the situation has turned around for them. One of the areas that we really delved into was, where is listening going? And while most of the, just about all of the examples in the book are case studies, how brands use them and things, they were all around building great advertising or changing marketing around some really valuable consumer insight that came through listening. But what we saw in where is it going is in a different direction, or in an additional direction is probably the better way to say it. And that is that listening is being used as data to do different things. For example, you can use listening data to predict sales. You can use listening data to predict market share, right? This is really, really helpful, because it gives us, as marketers, another way to forecast, what we're likely to get, and it gives us some advanced ideas about how we can change and adapt our marketing strategy. Beyond what I think of as like the marketing science part, there's also the ways that listening is leading the practice of media. For example, targeting audiences. Generally, we target by day part, we target by demographic, we target by geography. We target, in all sorts of different, standard ways. But some work that CNN did, they looked at it differently. They asked the question, what is our audience talking about offline, right? So they did a study with Keller Fay, and what they found was that CNN audiences over-index on talking about Lexus automobiles. They didn't know that. And so now, when you know what your audience is talking about, you can actually go to those advertisers and say, would you like to target Lexus owners? We've got them. We've got them in spades here on CNN. And so, so by understanding really the conversations of what people are listening and talking about and how they do relative to other programs or other vehicles, this gives us a brand new way to target and make sure that we spend our advertising dollars in an optimal way. So listening, is not only influencing, how we do research, how it's used. It's influencing, marketing science, forecasting, media planning and buying. It's also influencing the way that we organize, our companies and our functions. And this is an area where there needs to be much more thought. We've seen listening being bolted on. We've seen it as, as a collection of ad hoc projects. But the important thing to keep in mind is that listening information is useful not only in the research department, in the media department, but in public relations, in the legal department, in innovation, in R&D, even in customer service, and even in shipping and receiving, and so the data has lots of application and potential use. Now, organizations need to figure out how are we going to leverage this information throughout the organization so that everyone is as tuned into the customer as they need to be. Because doing so is only going to influence and positively affect the performance of the brands and the performance of the company overall.